He led the greatest war effort in his nation's history. And in the turbulent post-war years, he won the Nobel Prize for his work in the cause of peace. Despite his great achievements, both as a soldier and a statesman, he became the subject of bitter controversy. His name is George Marshall, and this is his biography. I'm Mike Wallace. This is Biography. Our story, General George Marshall. A dedicated professional soldier, he had risen to the highest post a military man could hold by the time World War II began. He was Chief of Staff, with responsibility for the most massive war effort in his nation's history. When the time came for the Allied invasion of Europe, Marshall wanted to lead it, but President Roosevelt turned down his request. Said FDR, "I wouldn't sleep easy with you out of the country." May 15, 1951. The guns of the Virginia Military Institute salute George Marshall. For him, this is a proud day, filled with memories and nostalgia. For his career as a soldier statesman had begun here at VMI a half-century ago. George Marshall is 16 when he enters VMI. Born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, once the gateway for pioneers heading west, Marshall's boyhood has been filled with extravagant tales of frontier scouts and Indian fighters. A soldier's life seems glamorous and exciting to the young cadet. 1902. As a new lieutenant, Marshall finds no glamour and very little excitement in the drab life of a peacetime soldier. An officer's most demanding job is to devise some means to maintain discipline and to ward off the corrosive boredom of camp life. Opportunities for promotion are almost non-existent. It will take Marshall 15 years to become a captain. 1917, the United States enters World War I. The American Expeditionary Force, led by General John Blackjack Pershing, sails for France. In the summer of 1918, Marshall becomes a member of Pershing's headquarters staff. Though he is promoted to lieutenant colonel, he is denied a combat command because of his genius for operational staff work. Marshall is called the Wizard. Says Pershing, he's a man who understands the military. September 1918. Marshall masterminds the complex preparations for Pershing's Meuse-Argonne campaign. Thousands of troops and guns, 1 million tons of supplies are moved up to the lines with incredible speed. Even now, Marshall still hopes for frontline duty, but the Allies are about to launch the offensive that will bring an end to World War I. Pershing and the AEF return to a tumultuous greeting in New York Harbor. In the excitement, Pershing, Marshall, and staff officers relax their customary discipline. Marshall will become the general's aide, and in the years to come, a warm friendship will grow between the two men. Pershing will have a continuing influence on Marshall's life and career. 1924. Marshall is assigned to Tientsin, China, to help protect American property during the political upheavals there. 20 years from now, he will return to mediate a truce in this same prolonged civil war. In the early 1930s, General Douglas MacArthur plays a curious role in Marshall's life. As Chief of Staff for the United States Army, MacArthur signs an order which relegates Marshall to virtual military obscurity with the Illinois National Guard. Marshall is bewildered, hurt. His gray, drawn look, his wife later writes, is one I had never seen before and have seldom seen since. When retired General Pershing learns of Marshall's assignment, he appeals to President Roosevelt to promote his former aide. Marshall, Pershing feels, is being punished because of a long-standing personality clash between MacArthur and himself. It will be 6 years, however, before he is successful in gaining Roosevelt's recognition for Marshall. In 1939, largely through Pershing's efforts, Roosevelt takes an unprecedented step. He promotes Brigadier General George Marshall over 34 senior officers to the rank of 4-star general, and Marshall is named Chief of Staff of the United States Army. (1941). Japanese envoys arrive in Washington to discuss mounting tensions between Japan and the United States in the Pacific. On December 6th, Ambassador Nomura receives a coded message from Tokyo. It is, in effect, a declaration of war, to be delivered to the United States State Department at 1 o'clock the next afternoon. U.S. cryptographers have broken the Japanese codes, and when the contents of the message are known, Marshall is urgently summoned to the War Department. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941. After conferring with high-ranking Army and Navy officers, Marshall issues a warning to the American commanders at Pearl Harbor. When Army communications, however, cannot reach Hawaii, the message is sent through much slower commercial telegraph channels. Marshall's attempts to alert the Hawaiian command have come too late. At Pearl Harbor, the American Navy, caught unaware, has been smashed by a Japanese task force. With the United States at war, George Marshall now commands the largest mobilization ever undertaken by the United States. His military planning, his decisions govern American forces covering 6 continents, 9 theaters of operation, and by the end of 1945, 8 million men. He insists on inspecting the battlefronts to judge for himself the progress of the war, what has been done and what must be done. When he meets combat men during his globe hopping, Marshall always feels a twinge of regret that in this war, as in the last war, his duty keeps him out of frontline fighting. Marshall's meeting with General MacArthur is marked by stiff formality. When we decided to win the war in Europe first, Marshall will say, this made General MacArthur feel that he was being neglected. There was some bitterness, some curtness. He meets also with George Patton. These 2 professional soldiers present a study in contrasts. A flamboyant battlefield commander, Patton admittedly enjoys combat. Marshall, however, is a strategist who looks upon war with cold logic. To him, battles are the means to ending the war as soon as possible. 1945. For almost 5 years, Marshall has shouldered the responsibility for American forces in Europe and in the Pacific. Now, as World War II ends, a new president honors the aging general.
Millions of Americans gave their country outstanding service. General of the Army, George C. Marshall, gave it victory.
Within weeks, General Marshall will ask to be retired. After almost 50 years, he is ready to end his military service. But instead, he will face criticism, antagonism, and controversy, which will cast a shadow over the accomplishments of his distinguished career. November 1945. George Marshall is called to testify before a joint congressional committee. An investigation is underway to find the reasons Pearl Harbor was not warned in time that an attack was coming.
The next information I had was the notification of the actual attack on Pearl Harbor. Out of my own recollection, I didn't recall whether I was at the War Department or at the House. I'm told on one side by the Secretary of the General Staff at that time, the acting secretary at that time, General Dean, that I had returned to the House. I'm told on the other hand by my orderly that I was at the War Department. I don't know where I was. I'm not aware.
Controversy centers on Marshall's actions from the time he received word of the Japanese ultimatum until the hour of the attack.
Admiral Stark tells me, and I'm quite certain he's right, I don't recall it, but he's undoubtedly right, that he asked me at the time of our second conversation that morning that they had a rapid means of communication and that I'd wish to use it. And I told him no. He couldn't, that must be a fact. I don't recall it. It must be a fact.
The investigation grinds on for weeks. The findings are inconclusive. Eventually, the tragedy at Pearl Harbor is blamed on a breakdown of communication between high echelons of the armed forces. But veiled hints that Marshall deliberately delayed warning his officers at Pearl Harbor make the hearings an humiliating ordeal for the former chief of staff. Almost immediately afterward, Marshall, as President Truman's ambassador, is sent to China to help bring an end to the civil war between the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. After negotiating an uneasy truce, Marshall urges a compromise, a coalition government of nationalists and communists. Though he is generally suspicious of the Reds, Marshall says that he holds out hope because, as he puts it, there is a definite liberal group among the communists. The nationalists, however, refuse to listen to Marshall or to compromise with Mao Zedong. Now, at Marshall's recommendation, the United States will halt shipments of war supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's forces. Marshall will describe his work as the most thankless assignment of his career. Later, his critics will charge that his activities contributed to the eventual communist victory in China. February 1947. After serving as Truman's ambassador, George Marshall is now sworn in as Secretary of State. He is the first general to hold this civilian office. A month later, he leaves the United States to join the Big Four foreign ministers in Moscow to frame peace treaties for Austria and Germany.
We're engaged in negotiations that affect the peace of the entire world. And naturally, we're quite conscious of the tremendous responsibility to the American people that rests on us during these negotiations. Up to the present time, there has been, I might say, more of frankness than of progress. But that is rather to be expected. In a matter of such grave consequence as this, with many differing points of view and differing interests, a great deal of patience and forbearance is necessary. Each group, each delegation has the interests of its own country closely at heart. That is quite natural, to be expected. But at the same time, we must find a common ground for the good of all mankind.
After 45 futile sessions, Marshall concludes that the communists seek only to exploit the weaknesses and then take control of Europe's war-torn nations. It is during this trip that Marshall begins to formulate a plan for strengthening Europe against communism.
It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist.
United States aid floods into Europe under the Marshall Plan. Nations like Greece and Turkey, threatened by communist takeover, are given the means to stem the red tide. Dwight Eisenhower sums up the effects of the Marshall Plan for a congressional committee.
One of the other things you hear is that there is no use of the Marshall Plan because the French won't fight, or the Belgians won't fight, or something else of that kind. I come back to the question of morale. If we cut through intermediate objectives, we finally get down to the basic and ultimate objective of the Marshall Plan, which is restore the morale of Western Europe. In other words, its purpose is to make them ready and willing to fight, because we know full well, if you can develop the morale in Western Europe that they had once, there is no question about their safety.
1949. Following a long illness aggravated by the intense strain of guiding the foreign affairs of the United States, George Marshall retires.
I have been asked to explain why I submitted my resignation. For one reason, it was bound to be quite a long time before I would be in condition to resume my duties. And the state of affairs in the world today are too critical to have a long interval without a Secretary of State fully occupied with the job. As for my future plans, they don't go much further than Mrs. Marshall and myself returning to the house to sit down and rest up from this pleasant ordeal, which I might say is probably my final appearance in such matters.
Within a year, however, President Truman will call him back to duty when communist forces cross the 38th parallel in Korea and a United Nations police action begins. Appointed Secretary of Defense, Marshall goes to Korea to size up for himself the progress of the war. He is an old soldier, and this, tragically, is the third war that he has seen in his lifetime. Upon his return to Washington, he is attacked in Congress by Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy charges that Marshall's willingness to compromise with the Chinese communists in the past has led directly to the conflict in Korea. Marshall, says the senator, is part of an infamy so black as to dwarf any in the previous history of man. The rigid self-discipline and reserve that Marshall has developed all his life, however, keeps him from answering the charges. He is defended by the administration and by his friends, and he will let his record speak for itself. Now, a more pressing issue faces Marshall. General Douglas MacArthur wants to break the deadly stalemate of the Korean War by bombing communist bases just across the border in China. Even when he is refused permission by Washington, MacArthur continues to agitate for pressing the war against the Red Chinese. Finally, MacArthur is relieved of his command by President Truman, and it is George Marshall who must sign the order. Later, MacArthur will say of Marshall, his enmity was an old one. Marshall wants to retire now for the third and final time, but he feels that to resign immediately after the MacArthur controversy would be misunderstood. 5 months later, however, on September 12, 1951, George Marshall makes a decision that will be final.
Naturally, I'm very happy to be permanently back here at home and not shuttling between here and Washington, and with no very grave responsibilities except our own peace and happiness. I think Ms. Marshall has somewhat the same reaction. Is that true?
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Well, am I wonderful, or is it wonderful now?
It's wonderful being back.
The Marshall Plan, which had brought economic recovery to Western Europe, now brings worldwide recognition to its author. George Marshall is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The ceremony is disrupted momentarily by a handful of agitators in the audience.
Communists. I have the great honor to throw over to you the insignia of the Nobel Peace Prize, the diploma, and the gold medal.
I accept this honor with profound gratitude that has been conferred upon me by the Nobel Committee. And I do it not merely for myself, more especially for the American people who alone made possible the authority and possible the funds which made the European recovery program a reality. Thank you very much.
Marshall spends his remaining years quietly as a gentleman farmer in Virginia. His distinguished work as a soldier and as a statesman is now a part of American history. October 16, 1959. George Marshall is dead at the age of 78. Said Winston Churchill, he was a rugged soldier, a magnificent organizer, and a statesman with a penetrating and commanding view of the whole scene. But George Marshall had always felt uneasy about extravagant praise. When he looked back on his own career, he said simply, "I did what I thought was right." George Marshall's sense of duty, of honor, was reflected both in his personal life and in his career as a soldier and statesman. After his retirement, a New York publishing firm offered him $1 million to write his autobiography. George Marshall turned down the proposal. He said, "The government of the United States has already paid me for my services." Mike Wallace for Biography.